any questions? And I ask those who have questions to please sort of stand up so we can sort of hear you and recognize you. Say who you are. Yes, sir. With the microphone coming back to you. A little adjustment going on there.
My name is. My name is Dr. Abdi, and I'm very grateful for this being organized this and inviting us to be here. Somalia is a very important news for the Horn of Africa, and for that matter, for the whole of the Middle East and Africa in terms of security, and also the African Union's perspective of good governance, especially as tallied with the concept of NEPAD. My question and my comments rotate around the issue of good governance. What is the notion of good governance within the Somali traditional culture, be it the Sufi or the modern one, the Salafi, Wahhabi? Regardless of the Sharia law, regardless of the brand of Islam, what is the construct within the Somali culture? I like the idea that brother shared about the female camel being sort of like the institutional cultural image of the Somali society. The second thing which my brother Yusuf did not touch, but bypassed, is really what sustains this conflicting Islamic type of movements. I'm talking about the older Sufi traditional Sunni culture that looks at worship and social civility, and the new one that is perhaps more radical and also has a very, very young population. So there is this big divide that I see: wisdom and youth, worship and cultural adherence and violence. And it appears there is also some money being pumped into this. Are there local, internal, or external forces trying to use the Somali conflict as a playground for a larger construct? So my question is, what does this new Sharia law or new arrangement between the radical groups, really, Sheikh Sharif compared to his senior partners is much younger, and then the younger group now are much more radical. I'm also concerned about the educational and social structure of Somalia that's been destroyed over the last few decades, especially the level of young people having access to education, so that whatever laws and governance you have the instrument of human resources to sustain itself. However, there's one big issue also we need to look at. The United States is pressurizing both the Taliban from the Afghanistan and from the Pakistan corner. Those who manage to survive, their next home is looked at to be Somalia. So Somalia is going to have very, very big influence for the next decades. So I'd like to ask whoever is out there, what is the Somali construct of good governance? Regardless of what happens within the context of this Sharia law. And the second thing is, Somalia is surrounded by the African Union, NEPAD, good governance, and as you just appropriately said, countries like Ethiopia, who were the targets of the ICU. If you remember, many people don't remember very well, Sheikh Sharif used to say every afternoon at 3 p.m. at the international conference, our next stop is Addis. That was his campaign. Addis Ababa was watching. And even now, whatever law they have, if their next stop is Addis, that place will not see any peace. So what is that notion of good governance that puts the Somali people together, especially with its neighbors, Somalia, Ethiopia, Kenya, and of course, Djibouti and Puntland?
Thank you. Panelists?
Good governance. That's a very good question. difficulty is when you talk about governance, it's a loaded question for Somalis. You see, and Africa is pretty much the same way. In Somalia, we have a way of being the canary in the mines. We react too easily. In any case, we had a tradition. I spoke about the big palm tree where elders would gather and decide on matters that affected either the community, the tribe, or the population at large. And one of the things that it did was, not only was it a system where everyone had access to, where you would go there and speak your mind about the issue at hand and make your case in front of the whole community. But what it had that the Western notion of law does not have and cannot reproduce is the fact that at the end of those gatherings, there were no winners or losers. More importantly, there were no losers. In the judicial system here, somebody loses, somebody wins. In the Somali tradition, the person who concedes wins the respect of the whole community by accepting the verdict of the elders as part of the community. It's a healing process that incorporates the whole community. Therefore, there's no appeal, so to speak. And that served Somalis for thousands of years. When you have the colonial system introduced into Somalia, where you have a hodgepodge of different laws, Indian laws inherited from the British, you have the Italian system inherited from the Italian penal codes, and those became the laws of the land, as opposed to what the traditional version of what constituted a just method of regulating disputes. So when you speak of what is the norm of good governance, there was never good governance in Somalia. I don't believe there's good governance in Africa, for that matter. I mean, there's no such thing. So what took place in Somalia is that we left the traditional way of dealing with issues, and we have incorporated what we call Western-style democracy, which brought one man, one vote, but that's about all it brought. Just because you have an election, that doesn't necessarily make you a democratic society. I mean, if that was the case, the guy in North Korea, Jim Kennedy, he won by 99% of the votes. So that doesn't constitute a democracy or a way to resolve issues. So good governance is a work in progress for Somalis and I can say in most of Africa. As for what's sustaining the Sufism or the old traditional way of seeing and interpreting Islam is the memory of what Somalia used to be. We are not, Somalis don't see themselves as non-Muslim. I mean, we're not being Islamized by a foreign entity. We have these new fellows who come to town saying that this is Islam. What you've learned before, what you knew before, wasn't true Islam. And it's amazing. It's truly amazing what a hold that has on people. And I was born in Mogadishu. I grew up in Mogadishu. The largest structure in Mogadishu was a church. I was practically raised by Jesuit priests in a boarding school in Mogadishu. There was not an issue of a hint of any kind of friction between other faiths, whether they may be Buddhist, Chinese, we have Hindus, we have Christians. It didn't matter. It was part of it. As long as you were Somali, you were assumed to be a Muslim, and that was good enough for the times. But right now, I'll give you a little story. I went back to Somalia back in a few years back. I took my daughter with me, and I haven't been back in the country for over 30 years. It's kind of ironic because I went through Addis I took the Ethiopian Airlines. And the last time I was flying through Addis, the Somali army was about 40 miles from Addis Ababa. It was the Uganda was going on in 1977. Literally, it was 40 miles away. And the next time I was flying, the Ethiopian army was in Mogadishu. So I mean, just to give you an idea of how things never change, you know, in our neighborhoods. And but going back to the point of Islam, there were kids who were born long after we were gone, and the tragedy in Somalia is that the class that was in line to succeed or to come next in line to the position of leadership was my generation, and not a single one of us, I mean, and I'm talking about not a single one of us was left at all. Is either dead or left the country. They are everywhere in the world, but in Somalia. And so you have an influx of folks who have never been in the cities, whose the only life they know about is warfare and disease and extortions and, you know, all kind of things that you can imagine. And there's no memory of a Somalia before that existed for them because they have never seen it. They have never seen it. My cousin, whom I've never met before, came to me, and as she was talking to me, she described, she kept saying, the Juhaliya, the Dark Ages. The Dark Ages. And I thought she was talking about the time before Islam. I'm not kidding you. I mean, and I'm going like, what Dark Ages are you talking about? I said, when people were naked in Mogadishu back in the 60s and 70s, you know? And that's my city, my time she's talking about. It was, but that's what they believe. That they believe that before now, Somalis that preceded them were, they were the devil. We are the source of why things were so bad. And the only way to correct this is to go, God can be wrong. And the reason why Shabaab has such a strong hold on young Somalis is that they have a winning argument. They are for God, the Muslims, they are for the nation, and there is no alternative. What is the alternative? Abdullah Yusuf, the Ethiopians, American drones bombing people away? I mean, what is the alternative for them? They are here to stay. Sorry to say, that's the reality.
Any other comments from the panel?
You said beautiful.
Thank you.
I have to take more questions and comments.
Any other questions? In the back there? All the way in the back? Tico?
Thank you.
Tico, say who you are, please.
I thought you said who I am. My name is Tukur Baba. My question is to Hussein. Somewhere in your presentation, you alluded to the fact that Islamic law is what the people want, really, you know, something to that effect. Can you elaborate on that? Is it not really more of a ruling class thing? That the powerful tribal and other communal leaders who impose Sharia law, and the people, of course, buy it as a form of some false consciousness. This is exactly what happened in Nigeria in 1999, when some of the states imposed Sharia law. But Sharia law was for the poor, whose hands were being cut. One official steal government money. They call it not theft, but betrayal of trust.
I don't know if I said, I said Somalis have always lived under Islamic law. That is who we are. That is our social contract. However, what I was trying to say is we don't know what it is that they have imposed. And they have not explained it yet. Now, as for the Sharia law, Islamic law being for the poor, I don't know about that in Somalia, but it's interesting.
Yes, sir. I'll take the question up here in front.
Thank you, sir. I'm Tasema, and I want to ask a question about the future of Somalia. Because, as I have observed and gathered from the briefings and the explanations that were given by the panelists, I assume that the problem that is concurrent at present has been exacerbated by external forces like Ethiopia and the US. But that simmering problem has been done, and it has to be resolved by the Somali people proper. But on the contrary, it's changing its faces, but the problem lingers. So what do you see in the future, be it from the Sharia law, or from the Aways movement, or from the Al-Shabaab, or from the current government in power? How would they resolve? Take into account also the autonomous regions that formerly were part of Somalia. How do you see the future of Somalia?
Who wants to take the first crack at that? Terrance?
The answer is not really. I don't want to really take it, but I'll say a few things. One of the irony isn't maybe the right word, but one of the characteristics of Somalia that makes it both fascinating and heartbreaking is that at a local level, the traditions of cooperation, the ability to build institutions and local ways of getting along, of building social capital and trust are very, very strong. There's a lot of local peacemaking in Somalia and in Puntland and Somaliland. The tragedy is that when it raises to the level of the state, nobody has found the right mechanism for making that stick, and then it seems to perpetually collapse. And so this is really just a thought in the form of a sort of a thought experiment. Is it the wrong formula to say that we have to reconstruct the Somali state as the Somali state, or rather are there ways of imagining a confederation, a constellation, an amalgamation of different types and unlike types of political units? Because not only are there these regional governments and cities that are governing themselves and local regional authorities, there's also extremely powerful networks of business communities that go all the way across Somalia and can move anything from anywhere, the cotton trade being the most prominent, but other things as well. That type of social networking, that type of structure is not, the Somalis are extremely good at that. The Islamic courts, not only in terms of are they imposing Sharia or not, this is my understanding, one of their primary functions was that they brought local justice to neighborhoods that needed local justice over things like contracts, over things like family law. And again, in that way, Somali institutions led by Somalis, run out of Somalia, were able to overcome those hurdles. It's not something the Somalis don't understand. And that it is out of that richness, out of those experiments, out of that capacity that a new Somali state, be a state, but stability and peace in Somalia may be created. I guess that would be my take on it.
On the point?
Yes.
Okay.
I think it's a very interesting question, but it all depends. When you burn your house, it's only you who are responsible for the building. If you help yourself, you will help. So as I've been examining the issue of Somalia and its future, it all depends, first of all, we have poverty of leadership. That's number one. Number two, there is no conflict in Islam and nationalism. So what we need here is to de-emphasize, decriminalize the idea of tribalism. Tribalism is just for Somali politics. And this is the cause. And who are using, which facilitate foreign interference, is the so-called captive intelligence, quote unquote, or the so-called intellectuals, quote unquote. These are the bridge whereby all this interference that you find is happening. So I think what we need is solidarity, nationalism, rebuilding and strengthening the Somali state, and then also a leader who can lead the movement towards that goal. I don't see any solution, for example, if you want to, it has to be a holistic approach, not a partial approach. Puntland, Somaliland, what's going on in southern, central Somalia, it's really out of the question. It's only because of what's going on, the movement. But I'm sure the majority of the Somali people, not the politicians, want Somalia as one unit. So I think for the international community to be effective, it has to see Somalia as one unit, not to see it through the prism of terrorism. I think it's us, particularly those who betray their cause. I mean, for example, I have been educated in the name of so many people. I cannot be a divider today. I have to be unified. So this is the problem we have here. It's really the problem of the intellectuals. Thank you.
Take a question in the back there.
Yeah. Yes.
Ambassador?
My name is Abdi Said Osman. I'm affiliated to ICAR. There are two questions, or rather two issues, that I want to contribute to raise. First is I think one of the major problems that Somalia is facing now is the crisis of leadership. And this has been really eloquently put by my brother Awale. And so therefore I do not want to spend time on this particular issue, because I think one of the most important considerations to be focused upon is really to have a leader who commands the respect of the people, a leader who's a unifier, a leader who really is has a popularity within the Somali nation. And therefore I think that itself is extremely important. The other point that I want to raise is now let's focus on the question of the solution rather than that problem analysis of the Somali case. I think the most important thing I think to take into account is how can peace be restored in Somalia? Because I think one of the major problems that Somalia has been facing and continues to face is really the lack of on the part of the international community of coming to a consensus resolution for peacekeeping operations, peacekeeping missions. I think all of us will realize the fact that on a number of occasions, in fact on numerous occasions, when the issue was put to the Security Council, there was this delaying tactics time and again, which really created more or less a very serious problem for Somalia. Because unless you have a climate or rather an environment of peace and security in the country, you cannot build institutions. You cannot create, for example, a climate for peace building and for really putting into action the programs that has been initiated by the United Nations. Now, old Abdullah today, I think when he was addressing the problem of Somalia, he said that what's happening now, we are seeing a coup d'etat against a legitimate government. And he was calling on the United Nations to intervene. And I think the reaction also of the Under-Secretary General for Political Affairs of the United Nations also has been well put. He said that I think this is the time for the United Nations to act and mobilize the UN peacekeeping mission. So I'm really posing this particular issue to the panelists. What do you think? Do you think that the United Nations peacekeeping mission, multi-dimensional mission, can really bring peace to Somalia at this stage? Thank you,
Ambassador. Terrance? Abdi?
Take a shot at it?
Thanks, sir. I'm sure he knows more than I do, the person who just phrased this question, so I'm a little hesitant to provide something different than what he probably knows. But the reality is, expecting the UN to pass a resolution and provide foreign troops into Somalia today is unlikely. The reason being, is because there was something called Black Hawk Down, and that has made a huge impact on the way this country and the rest of the world views Somalia. And it was in large part responsible of why the genocide took place in Rwanda. The rest of the world simply did not want to put any more, European, Western troops in harm's way. So, what nation on earth would want to send its soldiers to Mogadishu today? I can't blame anyone for not wanting to send the soldiers there. It's just not a viable solution. No, I just don't see that happening.
I largely agree with that, and to the extent that my feeling listening to the discussions around Washington, and to the extent that I hear anything out of New York, is that the overwhelming concern is in Sudan, the breakdown of the CPA in Sudan, and that's what has everybody fully engaged. That's the worry rather than Somalia, although I would be very happy to see Somalia rise higher on the agenda of the international community. But let me shift this slightly and talk, again in kind of narrow terms, but about the current government, the current transitional federal government led by Sheikh Sharif, which is, if you were to ask me 6 months ago, would we be in a position now where the Ethiopian military would withdraw from Mogadishu and that Abdullahi Yusuf would step down peacefully? I mean, he stepped down, he wasn't killed. And another leader from the Union of Islamic Courts come into power in Somalia, I would say that's not possible. That's dreaming. It's too optimistic. There's no way you could get there. And yet it's happened. And I think within that, with all of the pessimism that has been echoing through the room, and I've contributed to some of this pessimism, but that there is within that process of the new transitional federal government a window of opportunity, as is so often the case in Somalia. It's a small window of opportunity, and the window is, just imagine, get your fingers out, because sometimes these windows fall very, very quickly. But that it shouldn't be misunderstood. I mean, I do think that there's an opportunity. Now the question now is the way to seize that opportunity to go with UN peacekeeping troops, or another thing that's talked about much, a great deal, for the international community to provide funds to pay for police and security forces that work for the transitional federal government. It's my feeling that the current transitional federal government will either succeed or fail on a political logic, not because it has more guns than the warlords. It either has a political logic that is compelling, that resonates with the Somali people, that works with the grain of other Somali authorities, whether it's elders, business people, civil society organizations, the regions like Puntland, Somaliland, and so on. If it can make that work, a very difficult problem, but if it can make that work, well, then you don't need UN peacekeeping. Then it's settled. If you can't make that work, if that fails, well, then I don't see how UN peacekeeping can help. And so it's really a political question. I hope and pray that the political solution is within the hands of the Somalis currently, but I'm not convinced that money for police who have not yet been trained and who in the past have been the main abusers rather than protectors of the Somali people, or a UN peacekeeping operation, which I think is a very long shot, are the most likely ways out of the current crisis.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I would like to direct my question to Mr. Mahdi Abdi, who, like myself, my name is George Stefano, by the way, an Ethiopian American citizen now, who seems to share somewhat of a different opinion about what Ethiopia did in Somalia. Another American citizen called it an intervention, and you repeatedly called it an invasion. My understanding was that the Ethiopian government was invited in by the legitimate transitional government of the time. And when the Ethiopian forces pulled out of Somalia, it has intended to support the present federal government and continues and would like to work with this government. So my question is, oh, and by the way, I think I'd like to correct your earlier statement when you said the last time Somalia invaded or tried to invade Ethiopia, it was only 40 kilometers outside Addis Ababa. I think you meant 40 kilometers outside the eastern border of Ethiopia. What I'd like to ask you is, now that pretty much all the foreign forces are outside Somalia, you have your own Somali people, and I can detect towards which ones you seem to be leaning. Do you think there is room for all these Somali leaders and elders and different tribal groups to work together, which is what your wish is? And could you also make your position very clear for me when the Ethiopian government went in to help, through the help of your own American government? Do you have problems with Americans' intervention, or America's helping Ethiopia to do what it did at that time? Thank you very much.
The gloves are off.
Thank you. The short answer is yes. Next question. Yes, I strongly disagree with the American government helping Ethiopia invade Somalia. And there is no other word for it. And as far as being invited by the Somali government to intervene into Somalia, that is the spin we would like to use to justify whatever, things we would like to put on. I mean, what was the expression? Put on lipstick on a pig and still a pig, and that's pretty much what that was. And there was a happy convergence of events. You had a bunch of idiots in Mogadishu, these Islamic parts, who said all the wrong things. They were going to go and invade Ethiopia. They're going to do all of this nonsensical thing that they had no power of doing. And that gave the pretense that Ethiopia and the folks who were advocating for the war against terror needed to go after 3 individuals in Mogadishu. 3 individuals. And that precipitated the invasion that took place because Ethiopia had already invaded Somalia. They were all the way in by double by the time they came through. So there is something we can debate and argue about what took place here or there, but between Somalia and Ethiopia, Ethiopian Somalis, we're neighbors. We have a long, difficult history that I felt we were coming to an end, because as a Somali, growing up in Mogadishu, when I was anything that had a negative connotation was Ethiopian associated. It's a fact of life. That's how I grew up. I saw Ethiopians as nothing but my forever enemies, because they were subjugating a large chunk of Somali population that we as Somalis felt was pretty much taking from us, even the British having ceded Yogat into Ethiopia. But that's a long story. In any case, having left Somalia, having lived in Kenya, where I had the opportunity to meet many Ethiopians, having lived in this country for about 30 years, obviously my perception has expanded, and I do believe Ethiopians, at least the ones I know personally, I have yet to meet an Ethiopian I don't like. I mean, they're really nice guys. They're good people. I mean, the food is great, and it's fantastic, and it was exactly what needed to happen. Meeting and finding someone who had this caricature that obviously wasn't true. But the difficulty we have is not between Somalis and Ethiopians. The difficulties we have is between corrupt dictatorship that exists in Somalia and Ethiopia, and that uses any means to perpetuate this animosity that exists between us, that had already existed. And the sad reality is, by Ethiopia invading Somalia and going all the way to Mogadishu, it has created another 1,000-year resentment by any Somali about what took place, including this one. So there's no missing words. Ethiopia intervened. It did what it needed to do to make sure it controlled, at least the idea was to control the events so that you can have a government that was more amenable to Ethiopian interests and needs. And it's not, I can tell you, it's not just my unique views, it's the views of most of the majority of the Somalis anywhere in the world, the way we interpret things. And that's ultimately what matters, how we see you and how you see us. Everybody else is just around the edges because they come and they go, but you and I can never go on there. We're there. And what needs to be to happen is something other than what's taking place. What we need is something different than Zenawi. What we need is something different than Al-Shabaab. What we need is more contact. What we need is the fact that we need each other. Kind of not. We look exactly alike. I mean, we're the closest people when you look at the larger African continent, that we have so much in common, and I think it's long overdue that we do something different about that. And that's what I want to say about that. Thank you.
The second part of my question was not answered. That now that Somalians and their own leaders are there, do you feel like they can get together and resolve the problem? Obviously, I completely disagree about your opinion about the Ethiopian leader and the Ethiopian people at this point in time.
Okay. No, I don't see that. First of all, I don't accept the premise that now that you only have Somalis among themselves and that there are no Ethiopian troops in the country. Ethiopian troops come in and out of the country anytime they wish, and they do that. Not only are they coming in and out, but they're actually providing weapons and support to one faction against the other. So Somalia is no longer in charge of its own affairs. There is too many people, as I said earlier, involved in the internal affairs of Somalia. The notion that you can create a government in a foreign country, whether it's Kenya, whether it's Addis, whether it's Djibouti, whether it's Yemen, whether it's Cairo, you name it. It reminds me of what did Einstein say? Repeating the same experiment time and time again and expecting different results every time is a clear indication of lunacy or something of that. We keep repeating the same experiment thinking that this is going to work. It's never going to work when you have these many players with so many different interests involved in shaping what a Somali government should look like. And 500 parliament, that's more parliamentarian than India has, and they have 1 billion people there. You have 36 ministers, not a single worker there. I mean, it's like having the State Department with not a single individual, and Hillary Clinton is in charge of it. What can she possibly do? It's lunacy put on top of lunacy. So no, I'm sorry, I don't see this happening because the discussion is not yet between and among Somalis. And I'm not passing the buck, and I'm not saying that they are unable to do this. I'm not saying that they cannot overcome this. What I'm saying is that foreign hands are not necessarily out of what's going on in Somalia today.
I don't mean to be clock watching, but I think we've got about time for another two questions, Hussein. What time do we got?
I would like to end a good note on that question in terms of like the relationship between Ethiopia and Somalis. I think I think the current government has got some serious problems. The dichotomy of having Zenawi against Shabaab, I think, is a little problematic because the two are not really the same. And it's it's very problematic. Because the two are very, very different.
Thank you, gentleman there in the middle in the aisle.
Hi, my name is Abdi. Now that the gloves are off, I'm going to try to join this fight. But I want to make a quick footnote, actually. The gentleman here said earlier that Sheikh Sharif, when he was in control of the Union of Islamic Court, said that every afternoon we're going to invade Al-Shabaab. That's actually entirely inaccurate. In fact, he was the guy who was trying to tell everyone else, you know, let's take it easy and we're not going to fight against anyone or something like that. Al-Shabaab and their emissaries were the ones doing exactly what you described earlier. So that's one thing. Another footnote to what the brother from Ethiopia said also is that, yes, the government, Ethiopia may have been invited by a legitimate government, but the UN Security Council, the most legitimate authority in the world, also said and discouraged Ethiopia to go to Somalia, actually, a few weeks before it did. My question, though, is to Terry, who just said that the only logic, the government can only win through political logic. And I'm wondering if you think Al-Shabaab has a political logic, because Al-Shabaab is the only challenge that the government is now faced, the only force that is now standing in front of the government. And as far as you know, people who observe Al-Shabaab believe Al-Shabaab does not have any political logic whatsoever. Their logic so far has been a jihad. I even disagree with your premise that they have a domestic agenda anymore. They have a lot of foreign troops. Their spokesman just said a couple of days ago that you cannot call our foreigners because they're Muslims. Your foreigners are foreigners, he said. And contrary to what my brother here said, it's not only Somalis in Mogadishu at this point. Actually, we have about 4,500 African Union troops in Somalia. Most Somalis have no problem with them, don't get me wrong, but it's not only Somalis yet. As the brother said, I think still Somalis have to still make their deal. So I'm wondering, Terry, again, do you think that those people who think that Muslim foreigners are not really foreigners have a political logic that the government can engage in?
A couple of responses to that. I mean, first of all, I think Sheikh Sharif thinks so. He sent emissaries to them, so presumably he thinks there's some reason for doing that. But furthermore, I mean, I actually think very much that Al-Shabaab has a political logic, and that is exactly where I think the contest comes. There's a political logic of the current government, which could be a logic of inclusion, of working with Somali culture, of offering regional Ethiopian others security rather than threats, and then that's one kind of political logic. Then there's an alternative logic, which is the Al-Shabaab logic, and that's a logic that tries to conflate, bring together Islam and nationalism, that tries to use local rivalries such as Ethiopia and Eritrea in order to gain access to resources, to advance their goals of political power, that tries to use certain forms of violence to polarize, to shock. And that's a political logic. One might well hope that's a bad political logic or a failing political logic or political logic that is not stronger than the political logic that I laid out that is potentially on the side of the transitional federal government. But that's, to me, where the struggle for the future of Somalia takes place, is a political logic based on inclusion and peace with its neighbors and tolerance more likely to triumph, or logic based on a different way of trying to build political power and authority. So that's why I see it as a political struggle.
I think we had one more question on this side before I come to you. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to ask about the Islamic Party, Hizbi al-Islam. Sheikh Sharif sold Islamic courts friends. I was wondering how Sheikh Sharif should approach them. Should it be different than his approach to Al-Shabaab? And is the struggle between Sheikh Sharif and Owais at this point based out of a power struggle, or is there real ideological differences?
Well, My only fear is I get Al-Shabaab. I get Al-Shabaab. I don't want to say they're very bad, but my only worry is I think I don't see any ideological differences. Awais is not really Awais is not a committed terrorist. He's a political figure. He wants power. I don't see him as a. So there is a political struggle, and my fear is that really this will go back to what it was in the 90s, where actually it becomes very tribal. That is my worry. That is really my only fear, because if we go there, it's going to be a very problem, and it might go for a long time.
No way.
I think we have time for maybe 2 more questions, though I think we need to wrap it up for the evening.
I just want to go back to the question of political correctness that Terrance said. It is on the force of their political logic that they could be accepted by the society. I accept it, but is there any respect when you take the 2 forces, like the transitional government, which is led by Sharif, and the Al-Shabaab group, which is not only running on its political correctness, but also is getting unhindered military support. So there is no political space that's left for the government in power, because it's been using all its stakes when it was a demand by the Al-Shabaab that the Ethiopian forces should go out as a precondition to open discussion. They did. Now it has followed another demand that the African Union forces should go out. Then it said again the Sharia law should be imposed. They did. So whenever the powers that be that are in the government are ceding their points, the Al-Shabaab is gaining. Not only is it gaining on the political ground, but also it's getting the military support from other forces as well. So is there a fair game, playing field that they play? Because if you, as you said, if the Sharif government has to win on the political front, it has to be given the fair deal, because it doesn't have the time. But that one is a cunning organization, as I can see it, because it forwards demands. Once the demands are met, it goes to another demand, thereby building its own military might after having made the other side bereft of any force. So, do you see any political space or respect to accommodate for both forces to talk and convince the public?
In some ways, I'm going to probably still dodge the question from your point of view, but I would say politics in Mogadishu is rarely played on a level playing field. It's very, very unlike forces, and it's a very, very tough game. However, if I had the choice of being the side that was regarded as the foreigners versus the side that was regarded as the Somalis, I would prefer the latter. So there are resources that the transitional federal government has in its struggle with Al-Shabaab and with other Islamist groups. Well, no, I actually think probably very, very, well, there's 3 options, right? Not to get into a whole, open up a whole other debate, but either the transitional federal government will succeed in holding on to Mogadishu, it'll lose control over Mogadishu, or have another period of protracted violence. I think all 3 of those are in play. I wouldn't predict one is inevitable and the others are impossible. And so in a very short to medium term, we will know on this very unlevel playing field with 2 forces engaged in a competition using very different political strategies, very different sets of resources, who has the better of it. I think that's an open question. Yes, sir.
Hi. My name is James Torito. My question pertains to the kind of public image of Al-Shabaab currently in Somalia. Al-Shabaab gained a lot of power during the Ethiopian occupation in Somalia, and that's where they mainly grew out of. Now that Ethiopia has withdrawn, what is Al-Shabaab's, I guess, role in Somalia vis-a-vis the current population? How does the population see Al-Shabaab, and do they really believe in Al-Shabaab's call that the TFG is a foreign government? So I'd just like to get your ideas on that.
Well, as it was just mentioned earlier, they first initially insisted that the country needs to be governed by Sharia law. Before that, there was the condition that the Ethiopians must leave before they wouldn't accept any kind of agreement with the government. When that happened, as this gentleman had earlier mentioned, there was the insistence that you have to have Sharia law in the country. And as a matter of fact, there was it wasn't that simple. There was a long time before they actually allowed that to take place, because what they really wanted was that to be the ones who actually implement, have the powers of doing that. There is it's really amazing how things are evolving. Most people believe that they are really a Wahhabi version of Islam that these people are practicing. And if you go to Saudi Arabia, which is basically the base of this Wahhabi movement, right, you have a separation, sort of like the church of state, like you have here, but that's an entirely different one. Where you have the royal family in charge of the government, and you have the Wahhabis in charge of laws of the country, and how you interpret the Quran. So I think they may have had something like that in mind in order to get some sort of a negotiation position where they would be the ones in charge of actually implementing the powers of society, how women should dress, whether girls could go to school. I mean, we're seeing some grotesque actions of that nature in Afghanistan, where little girls are being doused with acid, and recently I was watching on CNN, they had some sort of like a gas attack on a school girl. Anyway, they can never be appeased, because ultimately what they really want is to bring the Muslim in all of us out of hiding and share that with the rest of the world. I mean, that's their mission, and God help us all, because that's what they want to do.
Well, I think we have to bring it to a close. Folks, thank you very much for coming. It's a very interesting discussion.